This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is August is that possible? It is already August the 6th, 2017, and this is WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and everything like that. And Dave has notes, and gives me a copy. That's okay. You can have a copy. I'm Dave on the board. I'm the sound guy.
Okay, we have a guest today in Running, and he's with his mother coming from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
To looking at various colleges that he might go to. He's in high school at the moment, and so he's meeting with interesting people. And they were here yesterday, and Liz, his mother, has been here, employed by the university, and went to the university here. And so we know each other, and we went looking at some of the local trail developments in the area yesterday. So, but let's, I'm interested in what Ian has to say, because he is of that generation that we have very dependent on transferring our information and our resources for the future. And he is interested in robotics. So I'm going to get him to tell you perhaps what high school he comes from. He's at a fairly new high school, I think.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions we have for high schools is how you do some of these things. So yes, rave on a little bit about what you do, and give young people at your own age an idea of what they can do in this changing era. We're right next to a news gazette, which has been going down and down and down because the internet has taken over.
Right. So I'm Ian. I'm from Shrewsbury High School in Massachusetts. And one of the things I've been doing for the past few years is I've been on the local robotics team at my high school. So we participate in FIRST Robotics, which is it's a worldwide organization that gets young people involved in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And our team builds big robots to compete against other teams in the area and around the country in a competition every year. And we also get involved in the community, and we spread our message, and we basically go out and try to teach young people and old people. We get everybody involved in robotics and in technology.
Yes, that's interesting that some of our older population is very computer savvy, so they can understand what you're doing. And people like David will help us communicate. If we don't know the lot, we know enough to be able to talk to each other. So tell us a little bit about the competition itself. You were in a very big stadium somewhere, and you were telling me that this is a competition. It's closed for a while, and then you all have to...
Right.
So tell us a little bit more in detail about this rather fun situation, and it's a national and international, perhaps.
Okay, so the way FIRST Robotics competition works is starting in about January and going into February, we're given a challenge, and every team is released the same challenge at the same time. And after that challenge is released, there's a whole set of rules for the game, and we'll have 6 weeks, about 6 weeks, to build, to program, to wire up, and to practice driving our own robot to compete in the competition. And then we put it in a bag, and we can't touch it until our first competition. And then we go to our venue, which is usually high school somewhere in the region or maybe some sports stadium that they've rented out, and will compete with something like maybe 50 other teams from the region. And so we have several different matches throughout the weekend. We compete in 3 versus 3 robot matches. So there's teams of 3 robots working together against another team of 3 robots working together. And the robots are always about 120 pounds. That's usually the weight limit. They're real big, and the field is 54 by 27 feet. Yeah, so...
And what do they do?
So the games are usually related to either sports games or just some other challenge. This year's competition was called First Steamworks, and there were 2 basic tasks you could do in the game. Your robot can drive back and forth from one end of the field over to back to your end of the field, carrying these large plastic gear-shaped objects and placing them on a peg on your end of the field. And then someone in a station in the middle of the field, a person, will pick up the gear and put it on a peg to score points for it. And the other thing you can do is there were hoppers all around the field, and your robot can pick up these wiffle balls from the hoppers and try to rapid-fire shoot them into these high goals. And at the end of the match, your robot can try to hang from a rope that your team brings to the field and latches onto a certain peg in the field, and your robot can try to climb that and reach a certain height, and that gets you extra points at the end.
And there's a negative to this. You can stop other people from succeeding with your robotry.
Oh yes, a big part of the competition in most games is that robots can defend against each other and try to stop each other from getting across the field. And often in the high-level games, that's really important because you have 3 robots that are capable of working together and scoring like every single point possible. And then it's very important to try to delay the opponents and try to get like those last couple of points up on them.
David is a person who plays with physical games, and so this is the other end of this sort of thing. So you have 2 people here who are gaming in a different way, and David might have something to say about that.
There's a game called Robo Rally that I will never play again, because what you do is it has a very simple programming language, and you have tokens that you place face down. You have to program how your robot on the playing field on the board is going to move for the next 6 movements. The problem is everybody else has programmed their robot also, and you never know what direction somebody else is going to go. And so at some point, your robot gets pushed by somebody else's. You're no longer on the path you intended to be on, and there's now a pit directly in front of you where there was not supposed to be one. So yes, I'm not a really big fan of robots when it comes to playing board games, but you don't have to worry about that. So I do have a question though. So you don't is there actually a person, is this like a drone where somebody's actually controlling your robot, or do you have to have it programmed already to be able to look at the playing field, determine for itself what to do? It actually is almost it's a form of artificial intelligence to say, from where I am right now, the thing I need to do is defend my goalpost or go over there and stop something or whatever.
Well, I think in most games and challenges, the first 15 or so seconds of every match is all of the robots are completely autonomous. So they'll all run something, and there's a different scoring system for the autonomous period. But usually doing tasks in the autonomous period gets you more points than during the teleoperated period. So after 15 seconds are up, the robots have all either done something or not, because some teams can't manage to don't manage to have a working autonomous program, but the teams that do already start up with a big amount of points, and then the rest of the match, which is about 2 minutes and 15 seconds, is human pilots are driving the robot. There's usually 2 students driving each robot, and then they'll have either a mentor or another student standing behind them to give them guidance, tell them, oh, go grab that thing on the other side of the field, or watch out for this robot, or something like that.
The human part of this is that your robotry allows you to think about the simulation of human activities. If you in a factory that you're making screws, for instance, you have an arm which simulates a human arm, and it puts the screw in a slot so something happens to it there, and then something else is happening. So does this have a practical application for what you might invent for some industry that's doing something? Tell me what the nth degree of this robotry is. This is a gaming experience, but it also can be real life, where you're flying an airplane or doing other things. Tell us how it evolves into a real life involvement where you get paid for doing this sort of thing.
Right. Well, when students are working on building the robots and competing with them, we learn all sorts of skills throughout manufacturing, throughout designing the robots, throughout testing them and putting them all together, and as well as all working together as a team to get it done, because it's a huge task. No one or two people could really put together a robot by themselves.
So it's a
That works
team
very
thing.
well. Yes, it's a very big team thing. Our team actually has about 80 members now. I think we're bigger than our school's football team, which is pretty cool.
Are your teachers involved? You suggested that some older people were involved. Are girls involved? What?
Oh, yes. Every team is coached by several adult mentors. Often they're either teachers from the school or people from companies, people from sponsoring companies, or just local volunteers or parents who just want to get involved and help teach the kids. Also recently there's been, I know especially in my area, or at least on my team, there's been lots more girls getting interested in robotics and engineering. So we do have a good balance of guys and girls on the teams.
So you also have done like school science activities, and you have a little experiment of your own to water plants. Tell us a little bit about this small individual situation, which also gives you the chance to learn different procedures and do things.
Oh, that's right. So a bit more than a year ago, I worked on a project for the local science fair. So I was designing a smart irrigation system, which is an irrigation system that it's automatic, and it would take sensor input from the amount of moisture in the soil, and it would water the plants with drip irrigation piping. So it would drip water directly into the roots next to the plants, and it would water them based on how much water was already in the soil, so that it would keep the plants always at an ideal moisture level. So I designed it with an Arduino board, which is just a little computer board, and that was taking input from moisture sensors, which were planted in the soil next to my plants, and I had a controller, which was basically measuring the current moisture level and trying to look at the past and possible future moisture levels in the soil. And it was deciding when it should add water to the soil to make sure that the plants stay at like perfect moisture level. And then so I have some water valves attached to, I had some tanks set up, but you could, in a garden setting, you would attach the water to a hose, and whenever the plants need water, it'll turn those on and give them just enough, and then it'll turn them off once they're back to the moisture level that we want.
And you used peas because they are interesting to work with. They're genetically, you can follow them, but the advantage of the peas is that you did research to know how much water. This wasn't some plant that was going to sit in water all the time. It wasn't some plant that was going to be in a dry desert. So you had a rough idea of what sort of volume of water the peas would need.
Yeah, I did some research beforehand. I looked around on some gardening websites, and I got a general consensus as to how much water they should get every day or every week.
Let me tell you out there in the boondocks that this is rather important research. Some of our most wasted water is where irrigation is concerned. So sometimes irrigation is put in ditches and the water is just flowed along in ditches. And these are open ditches and there's a lot of evaporation and a lot of waste of that water. The alternative is to have a spray system that is perhaps 10 or 12 feet off the ground, and by the time the spray hits the plant that's underneath, there's a lot of evaporation and wastage. So this is an experiment to provide the minimum of water that you need and to make sure that it gets to the roots in the place where it should be. So
Right.
This is wonderful.
So I actually tested my automatic system against a manually controlled system where every day I would just manually turn on a little valve and then let a certain amount of water go into the plants. And all of the plants grew to about the same height, but the automatic system used a whole lot less water than the manual system.
Yes, so that's the wonder of this. And this is a spin-off of the sort of things that you do with robotry and getting to know. I'm fortunate to have Dave work with me as a computer person, and what is very helpful is that he teaches me the language and the principles, so I may not be able to do something quickly and that he can do, but I can tell him what I want to do, or what he can tell me what I can or can't do. So this is very, very interesting. It goes to a different sort of schooling system. In Champaign, we're looking at reviving an infill high school and enlarging it. And one of the questions that architects have and students have and teachers have is a lot of people are doing things like robotry, and it's teamwork, and you need architectural spaces where you can find 6 people together and they're doing interesting things. Tell us a little bit about your high school, and does it have room for these sorts of groups?
Right, so I go to a relatively newer high school. I think it opened in about 2001 or 2002, Shrewsbury High School. And we have, our team has a whole workshop in a back closet, and we get to use one of the engineering rooms at our high school. So our high school basically gives us a large workspace. I know that other teams have even larger dedicated workspaces thanks to their sponsors, and some teams just work out of garages or something like that. But everybody has their own way and builds their robots and gets to competition.
That's very good. You happen to be in a high school situation where next week I'll have Daniel McCollum on here to talk about the local things. Daniel has been mayor of Champaign for 11 years and retired from that situation, but he's very much a historian of the area. But if you go to Google Daniel McCollum, you find his son is also Daniel McCollum. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting that you come from a high school in Massachusetts where Daniel's son and grandchildren are there.
Oh, yeah. His daughter Maya also goes to my school, which is funny.
What does the son do?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, I think he's in the sort of field that involves computerization too. I didn't check that, but so I have a question for you. It involves what you saw yesterday. You bicycle in interesting terrains. Your roads aren't rectilinear. Can you say something about the difference between you riding a bicycle in Massachusetts and looking at a bicycle trail in Illinois that is very straight and perhaps a little boring, and how do we do it?
Oh, yeah. So yesterday, David wanted to show us some rail trails that have been, looks like recently put together in the area here. And they're very long and straight. And I know back in Massachusetts, at least right near where I live, there's not a whole lot of that. And when I go out biking, I always take some more windy roads and the back roads. And I know in my town, there's lots of more quiet roads where there's not a lot of cars. And one route I like to go down every so often is I bike down to a nearby reservoir and ride around there.
Yes. Do you have any system where you can put a cell phone on your handlebars and come to a certain point and have that tree interpreted, or that the drainage ditch looked at? We were looking at drainage ditches yesterday and some backhoe working on it. Could you come to have a trail guide on your handlebars that you could go on an independent tour of a certain area? Is that a sort of thing that would be possible in your imagination?
In my imagination, certainly. I know there's already GPS devices. You can bring up maps on your phone and get your phone to tell you exactly the route that you want to go to. So I'm sure it's not very far off to just mount your phone in front of you and be able to take pictures or just find little things like that.
What Dave's describing here is if you've ever been to a museum where they have walking tours, you put on headphones and they will actually tell you, and now you're looking at this picture, and now this is a sculpture of whatever. There are people who are starting to do this for example, if you go to a park, a state park, for example, if you have your cell phone and this app, the app will tell you, oh, from where you're standing now, if you look to your right, you'll see a waterfall. And if you look over there, that's Starved Rock, and here's the history of Starved Rock. And people are starting to even do this on, for example, country roads. Dave is imagining if you've got a cemetery over here, when you get to that point, the app will tell you, oh, in this cemetery you'll actually find some original prairie. This has never been removed since the days of, before people were here. And if you go another mile down the road, now you'll see a stand of trees. And people will say, those trees don't belong there. That's not a prairie. That's man-made. And then you see some clover. And he says, the only reason that clover is there is because people are here. And people bring animals, and animals eat clover. The clover itself shouldn't be there. So yes, it's the same sort of thing you'd have if you went to a museum, except taken outside, where you go much further distances, but somebody has put it together so that you can have the background information of what it is that you're looking at.
Also, when you're at that site, you might be there in fall, and it might be interesting to know what's there in spring. And you're not probably going to come back to that location, so you have that sort of information available. It's like pulling information off the internet.
Well, I should try that sometime. That sounds incredibly useful.
So you have a bicycle. David has a bicycle that is half-inch wide tires. You were on a trail yesterday with chipped limestone, crushed limestone. Do you have a mountain bicycle, or what sort of tires do you have when you ride up these hills?
Oh, I ride a mountain bicycle around my town. It's a very hilly area, and there's lots of off-road areas, and the roads themselves aren't very well kept, but there's lots of nice off-road trails too that I like to take. So yeah, I take a mountain bike.
So do you have shock absorbers on your bicycle?
Oh yeah, it has shock absorbers on the front. It also has pneumatic brakes, which are really smooth.
Uh-huh. They're gentle.
Yeah.
You don't have a sudden braking. It's
Yes.
rather nice. Yesterday we were looking at bottomlands and meanders, and so if you go back to Massachusetts, I'm trying to think how much biology and sociology will you get in your career as a robotics sort of person? Sometimes we have to talk to engineers that don't have a lot of biology and sociology. So how do you take this sort of message to, you say, your classroom? Can you tell your classroom some of this information, and how can you do that, and how in your career can you balance the need for knowing the human body, the sociology, the ethnicity? You're coming into some of this with a background of two parents that have a computer background, so you have a start. How do you understand the Norwegian community or the Irish community or the German community? How do you fit that in your high school curriculum?
Well, I know that there's a very diverse group of students at my high school coming from all different backgrounds. And I know all of them get involved in different things. We have all sorts of clubs for students. We have a Muslim student club. We have a club for African American students. We have Chinese language club. We have an Asian culture club of students that just
Asian Indians?
mostly Asians, like from I think China and surrounding regions. But I know that as other students who aren't part of those races also participate in those clubs and just get together with their friends there and learn about different cultures. So I think there's lots of opportunities for that.
Okay. I actually go to railroad seminars to be able to understand the language of railroaders, and we buy up old railroads for the prairie that's on either side of the railroad bed. And so I have to understand how Wi-Fi works. If the tree is in the way of the Wi-Fi, then you might want to know what the other end of the train is going to be doing. The tree might be in the way. So then you have a sociological question of, do we remove the tree or do we do something that goes around the tree? So it's helpful to be able to understand this sort of background. Do you have community colleges in your area?
Yes, I know there's a community college nearby called Quinsigamond Community College. And I know some people who've went there.
So there's a lot of history in the East. This is where the country developed.
Yes.
And so do you have historic sites that are of note that are near you? You just mentioned the name that sounded rather Native American.
Oh, that's right. There's lots of historic sites nearby. From Boston, they keep around all sorts of places in Boston, like the Old North Church, certain cemeteries and monuments. There's locations at Lexington and Concord I've gone to see, where the battles of the American Revolution were fought there. There's even monuments in my town, and I know a lot of places in the area are named after Native American names.
Do you find the difference when you come to the Midwest? What things do you find surprising? I came from Australia, and it's very different for me. What is it that's different for you when you come to the Midwest?
Well, one thing is that it seems a lot more rural here. Like, I don't know if it's just the location, but yeah, there's a lot of farmland, which you don't see in the East so much. It's very flat, yeah.
Okay, you will be going to Chicago, which is a very big city, and that has its own history, and that is again interesting. So one of the things that was asked of me yesterday is, what do you sort of do with the territories that you're interested in? And so I, last night, went back out to the site where we had seen someone digging with a backhoe in the soil. And I needn't have done that, but I am concerned with a native prairie that's along a road that has been vacated. So I sat down to write a little bit about this because that is sort of what I do. And there were several things that were of interest to me to show other people, because they don't always see these things. The area towards St. Joe is a very big meandering stream, and that meandering stream has been channelized, and there's a bridge across the stream, and it has a sigmoid curve, and the railroad chose to go across at the node, and so we were looking at that sort of thing to see that in a rather rectilinear country where the roads go north, south, east, and west straight, this is a side road that is rather being allowed to grow so that the prairie actually grows on the site very well, and it's coming back since we have had a no-mow policy on it. So we were looking at a bridge for bicycling, a bridge on top of a bridge. It was a simulation, a prefabrication, so that cranes came in and put the bicycle bridge on top of the road bridge. And that, in its day, without a bridge, is a bridge with ties that you can see down to the water, and it's a little high, and people get freaked out by going across it. So we dropped in ties between ties. Well, now those ties are all covered up with another bridge, and I was interested that they had taken out there's a cutoff so that the water would run off more quickly. So it's a straight cutoff, and a lot of tree material accumulates at the bridge. So I was interested to see that the contractors that are working on this trail are taking out that material so that it won't injure these pillars that support the bridge. Let me ask you, do you have rail trails in the east, and are you aware of them? Because there's like 30,000 miles of rail trails across the country. We have very few because the farmers want the land for farming. But you have interesting places. Are you aware of any?
I know that there's a rail trail somewhere nearby where I live, and there's quite a few more in the east, but none like right in my town. But yes, I've been out to one near where I lived several years ago. I know my mom took me there. We walked on it and saw a lot of the scenery there.
Uh-huh. You're near to water. I don't know how far you are from water, but there are a lot of trails that are now beginning to look at water. They're riparian trails. So canoeing is an interest that people have. Are you near to water?
I've never been canoeing before. We live several miles from the ocean, from Boston and that area.
You mentioned a reservoir.
There is a reservoir nearby. It's not really used for recreational things like canoeing, but it's very pretty.
Yes, and it's probably providing water for populations of people,
Yes.
so you don't really want a lot of people in the water there. So, okay. So when you think of doing things, will your interest be in computer science, or how will you look at your future employment? Will you be a specialist in the procedures? Will you be working with engineers that doing things? Will you be a physicist that's looking at the stars, or what do you dream to do when you?
Well, looking through different majors available at the colleges, I thought I was most interested in probably computer engineering, because it does a lot of combining different disciplines together and going from hardware to electronics, and then designing how to control that with computers, and also just designing computers too, which I've always been quite interested in. I'm not quite sure what exact job I'd like to pursue.
That's quite understandable.
Yes.
Some of us never know. But yes, it's in the general territory we're thinking of. One of the things that intrigues me a lot is human brains. And here in Illinois, there's a lot of research going on to figure out what happens when you think certain things, what happens when you see certain things, and that translates to what we can simulate with computers. But it's a rather serious field, and I don't know whether that's something that you've thought about, but as humans we have to think about that, and how we have a twinkle in the eye, and how that influences dopamine or something that oozes into your synapses in your brain, and so I find that intriguing. If you have any comments there, there's a new medical school here that is starting to do that sort of thing, and often they are simulating with a piece of titanium and a replacement of a bone, or these are really simulating what is in nature, and if nature has failed, then how do you replace that?
Yeah, I think that one thing that's pretty interesting is how advanced some prosthetics are becoming. I mean, there's researchers building entire limbs that work and behave just like a real limb, and they're working on hooking that up to actual brain cells so you can control it like a real arm too. So that's something that might be interesting to look into as well.
Yes. So,
We haven't given a disclaimer or anything like that. It's 20 till the hour now, and you're tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk program, and let's see, well, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else. And yes, we have the Beckman Institute here. It came along in the very late 80s or the very early 90s, doing what Dave just said. Okay, you've got all these technical people who know the machinery stuff, but we've also got advanced minds in this town studying how the brain functions. How do we sense the world around us? How does our brain take that sensation and turn it into the perceptions, the things that are what we call our consciousness? And what do you get when you put those branches of science and engineering together with each other? So you may be thinking more of the technical end of things now, but you never know, you might start working with the very squishy end of that stuff, because after all, there are a lot of people who will be using this stuff. And do you want to pattern the stuff that you create after the way people already think, or can you do it better? Maybe the way people think isn't the best way to do it, and now that you're independent and you can just program the computer the way you want it to be, do something completely different, make it sense things in a way that's completely alien to the way human beings have evolved to do it.
That's very interesting. I'm thinking of a sewing machine, and a sewing machine the person that was working with the research on it was trying to figure out how his wife would work with the needle, and he never could simulate that. But then he got an idea that instead of having one thread, you had two threads, and then you could loop one over the other, and that enabled the sewing machine. And so it's just as what David is saying is, it might be something totally different way of doing what the human would do in the first place.
I read about one very complex problem for robotics was folding laundry, and that it's just very difficult to get a precise movement that can fold the laundry the same way every time, because there's so many different ways that a piece of fabric can come out.
So, sometimes I'm interested in what high school students do when they become a little bit politically aware. We have locally a bunch of high school students who have done a lot to collect seed and then process seed for me. But they were a group of people who didn't believe in certain environmental things that were happening around the school, and they became rather political. They did not want the sugar that comes with Pepsi or drinks that are perhaps available to students. They didn't want certain environmental things. Do you have a group in your school that has a bent on doing environmental things that are interesting and intriguing and perhaps a little intimidating for their administration?
I know that there have been some environmental groups that try to raise awareness in the community, but I haven't seen anything happen on such a large scale as getting in the face of administration. Now, I know on the topic of food that in recent years, the schools have almost eliminated all of these things like sugary drinks, like sodas, in lunchrooms and in vending machines, mostly due to new food regulations. And I know that portions for lunches have become smaller, and they've changed what they're serving.
That's exactly what I'm thinking about. I'm trying to think. I'm in a different era, and so I'm trying to think of things that you can say as a budding college person that you might want to say to your counterparts. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of is how will you exercise in the next 40 years or 50 years? You will be in front of a computer a lot of times. How will you keep your body well?
Right. I know that it's not as simple anymore to go out and just get exercise while you're working. But recently I've started going out running more. For the past few summers I've been biking a lot, but now I decided maybe I'd go for the school cross-country team. I'm not sure if I'll have enough time for that come fall, because I'm taking lots of challenging classes, and I have lots of work to do after school between going to robotics and coaching middle school Lego robotics teams. But I've been trying to get out running, and I know that's an activity that everybody can do pretty easily. And it's fun, too, getting out to see nature, even if you don't go on trails, even if you just take a run around your town. It's nice to get out. You see some things that you wouldn't otherwise see.
Yes, I often walk in areas where there are homes that are maybe small or large. They may have right out in front of their yard a little cubby house with books in it. So there's a book exchange locally, or just interesting things that you notice. And
I saw one of those on a street while I was out the other day too. A little neighborhood library, they called it.
Yes. Those sorts of things give you some confidence. And I think one of the things that's most wonderful is to be eager to do things, to have a twinkle in your eye, to find fun at this, to be able to handle failures and learn from them. You probably have gone through some of those sorts of situations already.
Yes, I know a big part of learning is failing to begin with. Like, our robotics team has made lots of mistakes, and as a result, we haven't always made it all the way to district competition or to the world championship. But when we make failures like that, we know what we did wrong, and we know that what we can do next year or next time to improve upon that.
It surprises me that a lot of the inventions that have been made over the years have never made it quickly. They have taken years to implement. If it's a steam engine or a boat or something that somebody has found interesting, there's a challenge where people who are expected to change are very willing to look at your mistakes and be critical of them. You then have to work with those communities to develop their excitement. So the failures you try to rectify quickly, but it might take 15 years to get the idea across, and then, bless me, it will take off, and it'll change the nation and change the world.
I think it's more important to look at how someone learns from and improves upon their mistakes rather than to just look at their failures. Yeah.
Yes. Trying to think of things that we might think about.
I'll toss out a professional mistake that folks made. I remember reading that there was a lander sent to Mars, and everyone was really excited, and it got all the way to Mars. It took months and months and months, and however long that takes. And then it went to the far side of Mars, and it was supposed to be landing, and they knew when it was supposed to touch down, and then it was going to report back that it had started itself up, and it was all ready to go to work, and they never heard from it. And somebody eventually went through the source code that had been written for it, and they'd made a mistake in the formula on how hard it had to brake so that it touched down softly on the land. They had part of the equation had measured their speed in meters per second, but at one point it was in feet per second, and that's not a good mistake to make. And so they estimated it smacked into the ground very hard, and that's why they never heard from it. So yes, even people get paid a lot of money and are responsible for millions and millions of dollar projects. So when your robotics don't work, be glad that you're catching it here, because you don't want Mars landers to disintegrate at high rates of speed.
Yes. I'm trying to think of things that might be helpful to others.
As an avid biker, pardon my jumping in here, I just call myself a biker. We're cyclists, of course. How far do you have to go to get to farmland? Because one of the great things about bicycling around here is it's probably no more than 15 minutes ride from most places in Champaign-Urbana, and you're on country roads, which are not the most exciting bike rides. But as Dave was talking about before, about what prairies look like in the fall versus the spring, crops. My mom's side of the family, there are a bunch of farmers over there, but you also get very familiar with how high the crops are, and you could look out, for example, this summer and say, that corn doesn't look as healthy as it usually is. It should be another foot higher come the end of July. So back to my original question, how far do you go before you get out of town where it's maybe even cropland or just not town anymore?
Well, I know that nearby there's a few smaller farms. Even in town, there's areas with the horses or cows or something like that. And several towns out, there's some larger ones. I know there's one that has a really good ice cream place nearby, one or two of those. But it's quite a long distance until you get to larger farms like you see out here.
You have German background in your family. Have you been to Europe, and do you find some of these things? Do you have counterpart students in Europe that you know and understand?
I've been visiting Germany a few times. The most recent was for a wedding anniversary. But I haven't been able to interact with any of the students there. I don't know any of them personally, and I also don't know the German language. But a lot of people there did speak English, so we could get around. My dad speaks German, so he gets along with his family and helps us get around there. But it is very starkly different, at least where we were visiting. We were visiting a very small town called Bad Stepford, where my grandparents there live. And it's a very small little town in between some mountains and rivers. And I know that if you go a little bit far out, I know we took a high-speed train from there to the bigger city, Hanover. But in between, there's lots and lots of open farmland there.
I'm trying to think.
Do you know folks from comparably small towns in America? Can you compare and contrast what small town life looked like when you were over? I didn't quite catch it. It was a long name ending with Stepford, but versus the small communities that you may have been in America. How are we different and the same?
Well, in Germany, I think it felt very. Well, a lot of things were quite old-fashioned. Like, one thing was the people there had never heard of air conditioning. So the place we were staying at night, we would, as soon as it got dark out, it was very hot. We were staying during like one of the hottest weeks there was a big heat wave, but we would just at night open all the windows, and unfortunately they also never heard of bug screens, so that was not very pleasant. But
many of the houses are of stone, and
yes, many of the houses there are very old. They still have this wooden frame construction with stone or with I'm not sure what the material is.
So the corridors may be cold, and people dress accordingly. So if it's cold in winter, they have a lot more clothing on than you have here with internal heat. You don't need that clothing. And to some extent, that is saving environmental expenditure of energy. Did you see any attempt to have solar panels or windmills that you see here? Yesterday we were looking at occasional windmill.
I know that in the big city areas there were I think there were plenty of solar panels, and in the countryside we saw lots of windmills out there. And on our way here, when we were driving out from Massachusetts, we saw lots of windmills also. So I think that the energy sort of efforts are somewhat comparable, at least in that regard.
So I'm going to say a few things to my general audience, because I think they need to know and watch the corridor that we were visiting yesterday. It is almost ready. The forest preserve is begging you not to use that corridor yet. There are additions that are being made at the junction of the roads. There are blind spots where you have a rumble strip, and so someone who might not be aware that this was a road crossing would know that it's a road crossing, so those have been put in. The culverts where water moves under the railroad bed have fences on them, the sort of fence that just will remind you that not to fall off into a culvert. The main bed is crushed limestone, and it's with some calcium added to it to bind it and make it a reasonably all-weather trail. It starts in a banner near to a Weaver Park, and you go from Weaver Park to Main Street, opposite Aldi's, and where there's a Walmart, and across Route 130, which runs south, and then it parallels 150 all the way to Kickapoo State Park. And one of the wonders of this trail is that it takes you out of Champaign, which is a really fairly level. It was a wet area. It was mainly prairie, and it takes you to a Vermilion County that has faults and geological background. That means that it has some rolling hills that could be where Native Americans could range out into the prairie, hunt and grow vegetables there, and then back off into Vermilion County in the winter. So you start to get something like a very high bridge. It's at least 100 feet high over the Vermilion River. You have to know that that will be the next target for development of a new phase of the Kickapoo Trail. There's a lot of mining there, and so we have people from Kentucky and Tennessee who used to do deep mining and now have faced with strip mining, and so there's a different setting there. So a lot of people from Champaign move into Piatt County, Vermilion County, DeWitt County, and Champaign County has people that ooze out into those territories. And we hope that you realize that. I think we're getting to the end. Thank you very much, Ian Runding, for coming and telling young people a little bit about your generation.
Thank you.
And so this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.